In the early morning of a medieval European town, the air felt the same as it always had. Cold, still, familiar. People woke up before sunrise, not because they wanted to, but because life demanded. Bakers lit their oven. Farmers stepped into muddy streets. Children rubbed sleep from their eyes. Nothing felt different, and that was the most dangerous part. Because in the year 1347, the world did not change loudly. It changed quietly. So quietly that most people did not notice it until it was already inside their lungs. At first, there were rumors. Ships arriving from faraway land, crews that looked thinner than before, sailors who collapsed the moment they stepped onto land. But rumors had always existed. People believed the sea brought strange things. They believed sickness traveled with foreigners. They believed fear exaggerated everything. So they continued living. They went to church. They shook hands. They hugged their children. They breathed. The first person to fall sick was rarely taken seriously. A fever was common. Swollen glands were strange, but not unheard of. Pain could be explained. Doctors reassured family. Priests offered prayer. Neighbors whispered but moved on until the fever did not break, until the swelling turned black, until the person stopped breathing. Death had always been part of life in the Middle Ages, but this death felt different. It did not respect age. It did not wait politely. It did not give time to prepare. It arrived fast, and it stayed. Within days, another person fell sick, then another. Houses that were full of noise grew quiet. A man who had walked the streets yesterday was gone today. A child who laughed in the morning was buried by nightfall. People began counting days instead of years. They asked each other the same questions again and again. How did it start? Who was sick first? Did they touch anyone? Fear spread faster than the illness. Markets became tense. People avoided standing too close. Some stopped going entirely. Mothers pulled children closer. Fathers spoke less. Everyone listened for coughing. Everyone watched faces. Everyone waited. As the weeks passed, towns changed, not suddenly, but slowly. The sound of carts increased, not carts filled with food or goods, carts filled with bodies, wrapped in cloth, sometimes not wrapped at all. In some cities, bells rang to announce the dead. At first, once a day, then every few hours, then constantly, until the bells stopped ringing. Not because death had ended, but because there was no one left to ring them. Inside homes, people made impossible decisions. Do we stay together and risk dying together, or do we separate and survive alone? Parents faced a choice no parent should ever face: touch. As the sickness spread, people stopped asking when it would end. They started asking who would be next. Entire towns began to reorganize themselves around death. Homes were no longer just places to live. They became places of waiting for symptoms, waiting for fever, waiting for swelling, waiting for silence. When someone showed signs of illness, the reaction was immediate. Doors were shut, windows were sealed. Families were locked inside their own home, sometimes by officials, sometimes by neighbors, sometimes by fear alone. In many cities, a mark was painted on the door. A warning: do not enter, do not touch, do not help. Inside those houses, life slowed down. Not peacefully, but helpless. People rationed food. They whispered prayers. They listened to every breath. When one person became sick, others often followed within days. The disease did not move randomly. It moved through closeness, through shared meals, shared beds, shared air. People began to fear each other more than the sickness itself. A cough in the street could empty a market. A stumble could cause a crowd to scatter. Human connection became dangerous, and isolation became survival. Doctors tried to understand what they were facing. They studied body. They examined swelling. They smelled the air. Most believed the sickness was caused by corrupted air. They called it miasma. To protect themselves, they wore masks filled with herbs, flowers, and spices. They believed good smells could block death. It did not. Doctors prescribed bloodletting. They believed removing blood would remove illness. It did not. They burned incense. They carried charms. They followed astrological charts. Nothing worked. The truth was something they could not see. Fleas, rats, bacteria, invisible, unimaginable. So they blamed what they could understand. Foreigners, the poor, minorities. In many cities, Jewish communities were accused of poisoning wells, despite having no evidence, despite suffering the same deaths. Entire communities were attacked, expelled, killed. Fear needed a target, and history shows that fear almost always finds one. As chaos grew, authority weakened. Local governments struggled to respond. Officials died like everyone else. Courts stopped meeting. Laws stopped being enforced. In some places, order collapsed entirely. People looted abandoned homes. They took food. They took clothes, not out of greed, out of survival. Priests were overwhelmed. They moved from house to house giving last rites. Many died doing so. Some refused to enter infected homes. Others continued until they collapsed. Faith did not disappear, but it changed. Some people prayed constantly. Others believed prayer had failed. Groups of flagellants appeared. They walked from town to town, whipping themselves, bleeding publicly, believing pain would cleanse humanity. In some cities, people abandoned religion altogether. They drank, they celebrated, they acted as if tomorrow would never come, because for many, it didn't. Children were among the most affected, not always by sickness, but by loss. A child could lose parents in a single week. A household could vanish in days. Orphans filled the streets. Some were taken in by relatives. Many were not. They learned quickly how to find food, how to avoid crowds, how to survive alone. Childhood ended early, very early. The plague did not discriminate. Rich and poor died alike. But survival often depended on conditions. Those who could isolate had a better chance. Those who lived in crowded housing did not. Cities suffered the worst. Tight streets, dense populations, constant movement. Villages were hit later, sometimes less severely, sometimes not at all. No one understood why. Patterns existed, but no one could see them clearly. As months turned into years, the scale of loss became impossible to ignore. Fields went unharvested. There were not enough workers. Livestock roamed unattended. Food shortages followed disease. Hunger followed death. The economy collapsed. Coins lost meaning. Labor became valuable. For the first time, survivors could demand higher wages. For the first time, peasants had leverage. The old social order cracked. Not because people planned it, but because too many people were gone to maintain it. In some regions, governments tried to freeze wages. They passed laws forcing workers to accept old pay. But enforcement was weak. Power had shifted. Silently, permanently. Cities that survived looked different, smaller, quieter, older. Entire neighborhoods were empty. Churchyards overflowed. Mass graves became common. There was no time for individual burials. Bodies were stacked, covered, forgotten. People learned to live with death as a constant presence. They stopped reacting to it the way they once had. Another cart passed. Another body removed. Another door sealed. Life continued. But it was no longer familiar. People noticed changes within themselves. Emotions dulled. Urgency replaced hope. Long-term plans disappeared. People lived day to day, moment to moment. Survival became the only goal. Yet even in this darkness, life did not stop completely. Babies were born. Couples married. People laughed, quietly, cautiously. Humans adapt, even to horror. By the early 1350s, the disease began to slow. Not everywhere, not evenly, but noticeably. Cities that had lost half their population saw fewer deaths. People stepped outside again. Markets reopened slowly, cautiously. The air felt lighter, not because it was safe, but because it was quieter. Survivors looked around and realized something terrifying. They were still alive, and they had no idea why. Some believed they had been spared by God. Others believed the sickness had burned itself out. Some believed it would return. They were right. The Black Death did return, again and again, for centuries, but never with the same force, never with the same shock. The first wave had changed everything. It changed how people thought about life, about death, about time, about power. It left a scar on collective memory, one that shaped art, religion, medicine, and society itself. People began questioning old explanations, old authorities, old beliefs, slowly, painfully. The plague did not create the modern world, but it pushed humanity toward it, by force, by loss, by absence. And the world that emerged was not the same one that had existed before. When the Black Death finally loosened its grip, the world did not celebrate. There were no parades, no victory bells, no sense of relief, because survival did not feel like winning. It felt like waking up in a place that no longer belonged to you. People stepped outside and saw streets they recognized, but lives they did not. Homes stood empty. Shops remained closed. Voices were missing. Entire generations were gone, not metaphorically, literally. In many towns, there were not enough adults left to remember what life used to be like. Survivors did not ask why the plague had ended. They asked why it had spared them. That question stayed with them for the rest of their lives. Psychologically, the plague left something behind that history books struggle to measure, a constant awareness of death. People who lived through the Black Death did not fear dying in the same way as before. They had already seen it, too closely, too often, too suddenly. Death was no longer an abstract idea. It was a neighbor, a family member, a smell, a sound. This changed how people lived. Many stopped planning far into the future. They married earlier. They spent money faster. They focused on the present, because the future had proven unreliable. Art changed. Before the plague, religious art focused heavily on glory, heaven, and order. After the plague, it focused on suffering. Skeletons appeared in paintings. Grim figures danced with the living. The message was clear. Death comes for everyone, no matter who you are. This was not pessimism. It was realism shaped by experience. Religion itself began to shift. People did not abandon faith completely, but blind trust weakened. Priests had died like everyone else. Churches had failed to stop the disease. Some believers questioned whether religious authority truly held power over life and death. Others became more devout, but in a quieter, more personal way. Faith became internal rather than institutional. Medicine also changed. Not immediately. Doctors did not suddenly understand bacteria. But the failure of traditional methods planted doubt. Bloodletting had failed. Herbs had failed. Astrology had failed. This did not lead to instant progress, but it opened a door toward observation, toward experimentation, toward questioning old assumptions. The Black Death did not invent science, but it weakened unquestioned belief, and that mattered. Economically, the effects were impossible to ignore. With so many workers dead, labor became valuable. For the first time, common people had leverage. A farmer could demand better pay. A craftsman could choose where to work. Lords who once commanded loyalty now had to negotiate. This shift was slow, often resisted, sometimes violent, but it never fully reversed. The balance of power had moved. Feudal systems weakened. Cities gained importance.
A new middle class began to emerge, not because of ambition, but because of absence. Too many people were gone to maintain the old structure. Women experienced changes as well. With fewer men available, women took on roles previously denied to them. They ran businesses, managed farms, handled finances. Some of these changes faded over time. Others remained, subtly reshaping social norms. Children who grew up after the plague inherited a different world, a quieter world, a world shaped by caution. Stories of the plague were passed down, not as legends, but as warnings. Parents taught children to fear sickness, to notice symptoms, to be careful around crowds. Public health, as a concept, did not exist yet, but behavioral changes did. Quarantine became more common. Cities began isolating ships. Travel was monitored, not perfectly, but intentionally. The idea that disease could spread through contact began to take root. Slowly, painfully, repeated outbreaks reinforced the lesson. The Black Death never fully disappeared. It returned every generation or two, but each return was met with greater awareness, more preparation, less shock. The first wave had taught humanity a brutal lesson. Life is fragile, and systems built on assumption can collapse overnight. Psychologically, survivors often carried guilt. Why them? Why not others? Some felt undeserving. Others felt obligated to live fully, to honor those who did not survive. This created a tension between gratitude and grief, between survival and sorrow. Many never spoke about what they had seen, not because they forgot, but because language failed them. How do you describe a city where half the houses are empty? How do you explain a childhood surrounded by funerals? Silence became a coping mechanism. The plague shaped collective memory even centuries later. Writers referenced it, artists symbolized it, communities remembered it, not as a single event, but as a turning point, a moment when humanity realized it was not in control. That realization did not weaken humanity, it humbled it. Slowly, over generations, new ideas emerged. Ideas about hygiene, about governance, about individual worth. None of these changes happened overnight, but they were accelerated by loss. The Black Death did not just kill people. It forced humanity to adapt or collapse. And adaptation came at a terrible cost. By the late 1350s, life stabilized. Birth rates increased. Cities slowly refilled. Fields were worked again. Laughter returned, but something fundamental had shifted. People no longer believed the world was predictable. They no longer believed authority was absolute. They no longer believed tomorrow was guaranteed. This awareness became part of human consciousness, passed down quietly, encoded in behavior. The modern world did not emerge directly from the Black Death, but it leaned on the cracks the plague had created. Cracks in power, cracks in belief, cracks in certainty. Through those cracks, change grew. When historians look back at the Black Death, they often focus on numbers. Millions dead, cities destroyed, economies altered. But numbers cannot explain what it felt like to live through it. What it felt like to wake up each morning wondering if today would be your last. What it felt like to avoid the touch of someone you loved. What it felt like to survive when so many did not. That experience shaped humanity as much as any invention or discovery. It taught people that life is temporary, that systems are fragile, that survival is often random, and that meaning must be created, not assumed. The Black Death was not just a medical disaster, it was a psychological one, a social one, a cultural one. Its shadow stretched far beyond its years. Even today, echoes remain in how societies respond to pandemics, in how fear spreads faster than illness, in how isolation affects the human mind. History does not repeat itself exactly, but it remembers. And the Black Death is one of the memories humanity never truly lost. It was the moment the world stopped breathing, and when it inhaled again, it was forever changed.